Hi everyone, so this is my third video in the shelf isolation series. Feels like I haven't done a video in a while, but it's because I was actually getting through the book that today's video is about. So it's Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. It's been on my to reading list for ages, and can't really show you like a decent cover. I think it's decent. But it's just a leather bound copy and it looked really cool, so I thought, yeah, I'll have this. um, Basically, you can immediately tell from the title the protagonist, Jane Eyre. So we'll get to it. So just to give you a brief rundown of the story, the plot is quite detailed, so I'm going to be missing quite a lot of things out because I don't want to ruin the story too much. But we're introduced to Jane at the start of the book as an orphan, and she's living in Gateshead Hall with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her cousins. And basically, we get the sense very quickly that Jane is mistreated by her family. Basically, they're in a wealthy position, but they treat her very badly, lowest of the low, no respect for her whatsoever. They like Mrs. Reed, her aunt, encourages the cousins like not to play with Jane, no interaction, things like that. So we learn very quickly that she's an unhappy child. And an altercation between Jane and her male cousin. I think he's a few years older than her at this point. She's about 10. He throws a book at her basically, and she hits her head, and all the blame's put on her, and she's locked in a room called the Red Room. And one of the members of the family died in there, and it's just got these like gothic elements to it basically. But we'll see these throughout the book. And Jane's locked in there for hours, and she goes into like almost like a fit of just emotion and like when you see like a child crying and it's just that, like they're shaking. it this is what happens to Jane in this room, and this kind of sets up her feelings of isolation that will happen throughout the whole book, and kind of the search for finding herself, the search to be loved, etc. So what happens is, after Jane has this kind of fit of like hysteria basically, she's visited by the doctor, and she tells the doctor her feelings, and he recommends that she should go to a school. So he consults Mrs. Reed about this, and she said, yeah, whatever. So she makes arrangements, and the school the schoolmaster, I should say, the guy that owns the school, Mr. Brocklehurst, he comes and meets Jane and Mrs. Reed, and Jane's instantly feels like some sort of discomfort around him, and the arrangements made for her to go to the school, and she stands up for herself. Not only is she a child, but obviously an orphan, and her aunt treats her very horribly, like very nasty. And she stands up to her aunt and she basically says, like, I will never ever call you aunt again. You've done nothing for me. Like, you've always been horrible to me. And the aunt is actually really shocked and taken aback that Jane would speak to her in this way. So it's organised that Jane will leave like very soon, next week or so, and she doesn't speak to her aunt, and she's just sent off basically to this school. And the school that she goes to is called Lowood, and it's a school for girls, very like emphasising on religion, strict routine, not given much food at all. We get this sense like of Jane's experiences when she first gets there. And Mr. Brocklehurst is not absent there often, but when he does come, there's an instant where he does actually humiliate Jane in the front of the whole school, based on what Mrs. Reed told him, because basically they paint Jane out to be evil. And Mr. Brocklehurst basically tells everyone at school to stay away from her. So she feels this sense of alienation a lot, and as a child that must be very difficult. And basically she learns to become obedient, and she likes learning, and she's happy to do all these things. And she actually ends up staying at Lowood at 6 years. Yeah, 6 years as a pupil, and she actually ends up teaching there for 2 years. But she's kind of settled into this big sense of routine, and it's getting a bit monotonous, I guess. So she basically wants to leave. So she advertises as a governess and asks permission of the school to do this, and they say yes. So she advertises in a paper and she gets a letter back from someone. I can't remember how far it is away now, but quite a while off. And it's a lady called Mrs. Fairfax at Thornfield Hall, and to be a governess for a girl that's about, I can't remember how old she is now, but it's called Adele and she's French. So Jane sets off, leaves Lowood, takes everything with her that she owns, which isn't a lot, by the way, and she's going to be paid £30 a year. So she ends up here, very agreeable at the start. She gets on with the girl. She's quite small, bubbly. Obviously she's French, very lively, and Jane, when on arrival, discovers that Mrs. Fairfax doesn't actually own this house. She's just the housemaid. And she soon learns to find out that the man that does actually own it is Mr. Rochester. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. That's just how I say it. And basically, one day she stumbles across this guy in the lane, and he's fallen off his horse. And she kind of aids him and helps him, and then she just goes on her way, and yeah, she goes back to the house, and it turns out that the guy that she had this meeting with is Mr. Rochester. And he's really hard to describe because we always get this sense when he's described that he's not handsome at all. He's about 50, and at this point she's only like 19, 18. And basically, we get this sense that this mystery is kind of built up about Rochester. We don't know a lot about him. It's only what Mrs. Fairfax has told her. But we learn his past gradually, and we find out that Adele was abandoned by her mother in France, and this is who Rochester was kind of like connected with. He kind of wanted to be with her, but it didn't work out. So he kind of takes Adele under his wing, takes her back to England, and makes sure she gets an education. And Rochester's kind of like hostile towards Jane at first, and we can't really understand why. But as things reveal and you go through the story, I'm not going to ruin it too much, but some odd events happen throughout the house, and this plays into Rochester's past, and eventually Jane does fall in love with him. A lot of members of like high society come into the house, and particularly a family of the Ingrams. So you get Blanche Ingram, who's very pretty. We get this emphasis a lot that Jane is not viewed as attractive, and she compares herself to this Blanche, and it seems that Blanche and Mr. Rochester are going to be married, and it really sets up these feelings of jealousy for Jane, and it gets to the point where she actually confronts him about it, and it kind of all escalates after she reveals her true feelings to him. But he basically admits he doesn't love Blanche, he loves Jane, proposes to Jane, and it's all very fast. But since this has happened, she's actually gone back to Gateshead because Mrs. Reed was ill, and she finds out that while she was at Lowood, someone actually wrote to Mrs. Reed, and it was her uncle, and he wanted to find Jane basically. And he was living abroad, and but Mrs. Reed, because she was so angry about what Jane did as a child and said she'd never call her aunt anymore, she told Jane's uncle that Jane had died at school. So Jane finds this information out, but she doesn't really like tend to do anything. I think she writes to him. I think she's going to write to him at some point, which she says she does. But basically, at Jane and Rochester's wedding, it all comes out that Rochester's actually already married to this woman that's locked up in Thornfield Hall, and you're probably thinking, what? But when you read the book, you understand why and how she got there and what it is. She's basically a lunatic, and Jane kind of can't really deal with this because Rochester like acts very like collected about it and explains it all, but he still expects Jane to like be with him. And we get like this whole sense of religion as well throughout the book, but Jane kind of runs away from Thornfield. She doesn't tell anyone. She doesn't. No one at all that lives there. She just disappears before everyone's woke up because she can't do it. She has this kind of, yeah, like moral compass, I guess, and she just thinks it's not right. So she leaves. She's got absolutely nothing, really. She spends the money on like traveling somewhere, the money that she does have. And basically, she's literally starving, like tired, hungry for days, sleeping out in the cold, and she stumbles among this cottage. And long story short, they basically take her in, a man and these two women. And to cut a long story short, as I've just said, they turn out to be her cousins. They're, they're not rich and they're not poor either. They're kind of sitting somewhere in the middle. And they get this letter one day saying that their uncle has died, but he's not left them any money. He's left it to someone on the other side of the family. And it turns out that this is Jane. And Jane doesn't actually reveal her real name to them. She says it's called Jane Elliot, where obviously we know she's not. And it all comes to light, and they're cousins basically. And Jane's left this inheritance money from her uncle that she's never met. And she splits the money between the cousins. And John, the male cousin, he's going to India. He's a missionary and he's a very strong believer in religion. And he actually asked Jane to marry him, but not because he loves her, but because he thinks this sense of duty. He needs to take, if he was to take a woman to India, they'd have to be married, etc. And Jane again refuses because she doesn't want to marry him based off like these false feelings, knowing that they don't love each other as husband and wife. Um, so after he's going away for 2 weeks, and he says, think about it. But she can't get Rochester out of her head, and she has this vision, like she can hear Rochester saying Jane, Jane, Jane. So she actually goes back to Thornfield to try and find him. And Thornfield, we basically learn, has been burnt down. And we find out that this whole thing happened after Jane left, and there was a fire there, and Rochester becomes blind and he loses a hand. And he's now dwindled down to this little house with 2 servants, and Jane basically goes there, finds him. They kind of like reconcile, because obviously they do love each other, and they end up getting married. So that's basically the plot. I've missed out a lot of things throughout. But this book will be really good for coursework in terms of like love, religion, social class, gender, feminism. You've got gothic and supernatural elements in there. It's really hard because obviously I've just read it, so I'm trying to consolidate it down myself to what I think are the important parts. It's a really good book. It was a really enjoyable read. I'd recommend it. It's a classic book in literature. It'd be really interesting for coursework, especially looking at the position of women or marriage, influence of religion, like the sense of agency, looking at it through a feminist lens as well. It'd be really interesting. So if you haven't read it, it's got some really important images in there, like the Red Room and how that signifies Jane's oppression. So as I said, this probably isn't the most like well structured video to talk about it, seeing as I've only just read it myself, like I'm not an expert, but just giving my first thoughts and opinions on it, I'd really recommend it. And it's not, this the font's quite small in this one, but it's actually not that long a read, so I'd really recommend it while you've got the time, and I think it would be a really good choice for a coursework book. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it and I hope this helps.